Welcome back to another Fantasy Tour de France strategy guide. This time we are going to be looking at low cost riders for the 2025 Tour de France, which starts in a couple days. And so this is a really important one because these low cost riders are a necessary feature on any team that expects to fill up with expensive riders. If you're taking the traditional conservative approach of five big riders, three small riders, well, you're going to need at least three of these guys to afford those big riders. So because there's a relatively small number of riders in these low cost categories, there's only 22 that are 5 stars, 6 stars, or 7 stars out of the total, what's it, 184 or so. Uh, because of that, these decisions are you can afford to scrutinize them a little bit more than all of your other choices because there's just so many riders to choose from and for all your other slots. Here, you're really limited in which riders you could possibly choose. So why not spend the time to look at who's going to be valuable, who's not? This is especially important because last year there were maybe four or five seven cost riders that ended up being hugely impactful for the fantasy league. Obviously, the big one was Jonas Abrahamsson. He was wildly undercosted, and everyone who did well picked him up really early, if not stage one. Also, Frank Vandenbroek, who came in second on day one and was in a couple other breaks and earned a ton of points. Javier Romo, a few others. These riders ended up being hugely consequential, largely because of the breakaway points that are awarded starting last year in the fantasy game for the Tour de France. Every 1 kilometer that a rider is at the front of the race, they get one. You get 1 point if they're on your team. So that's huge. If a rider is in the breakaway for 200 kilometers, that's 200 points, which is equivalent to winning a stage. So we got to make some risky decisions here, and we really want to get them right. So let's take a look at these. First, I'm going to start with the seven cost riders. So these riders here, and I have sort of grouped them into three categories: the good picks, the riders to consider but are not top of my list, and then everyone else. And so you can see that I've sort of color coded over here. They're not exactly in order of my recommendation. Basically, everyone in this gray category I don't recommend. Um, but for these top six, they're roughly in order of how I would recommend you prioritize them. Of course, you have to compare that to the rest of your team, how many people you have, for example, on total energies. You can't exceed three of the same trade team riders, etc. You got to look at the rest of your team. But I'll go through that. Before I do, though, just some words about the spreadsheet here. So this is just an extension of the regular rider data spreadsheet that I maintain throughout the tour. I've just added a bunch of columns over here for pre-tour analysis, and I'm going to be hiding these cells once we start the tour. This is really just data I want to have in front of me right now. Um, the color coding is very, very roughly anything that is shaded red is a negative factor. It would be a reason to not pick up a rider. Anything that's shaded green is a positive factor. It's relatively good compared to the others in this list. And anything that is bright green is really good compared to others. And so, of course, the three riders that I'll recommend in the 7 star category and the one rider I'll recommend in the 5 star category, they've got their cells shaded bright green, while the lesser recommended riders are light green. And then the riders I don't recommend are in gray. Um, so let's start at the top. Matteo Verche, I think, is my top recommended 7 star rider. And this is for a number. Oh, sorry. Before I get into that, just want to talk about the data here. Obviously, if they're eligible for the white jersey competition, that's important for you to know. I listed their UCI world ranking and their PCS ranking compared to all other active pro riders. Importantly, I've looked at the number of breakaways that they've been in, at least the number of times they've been credited as being in a breakaway according to PCS in 2025, as well as the cumulative number of kilometers they've been in the break during all of their breaks in 2025. Also, just looking at the number of wins they have over the course of their career, obviously you got to sort of take this with a grain of salt because the older riders who were successful when they were younger are going to have more wins. Number of Grand Tours, there's a couple of people here that are making their Grand Tour debut. Number of Tour de France starts. There's a number of riders here that are making their Tour de France Tour de France debut, even if they've been in the Vuelta or the Giro. Number of finishes. This is important because if a rider is going to be, dropping out after stage 12, um, it doesn't bode well. That is, you might see a negative factor here for Alexis Renard, who started twice and didn't finish either time. So in fact, let me just clean this up. That is a negative thing to consider. Also, I looked at their best finish ever in the Tour de France. That's in the yellow jersey competition, as well as the number of breakaways, number of stages in which they were in the breakaway, and number of total kilometers spent in the breakaway, according to PCS, in their last participation in the Tour de France. And then finally, here, the last data point is the number of points they earned in last year's Fantasy Tour de France, which obviously is only relevant for folks who were in the Tour de France last year. I also provided the rider profiles. This is, looks like Matteo Verche got deleted. I'll have to fix that later. But if you widen this, you can see every rider on PCS has their points earned broken down by category of race. So it's just good to know which type of riders are getting most of their success in the hills or on climbs versus ones that are getting most of their points from sprints or one-day races, etc. So I've also provided just some notes about their role on the team. And this was mostly in a couple cases, it was taken from interviews that I've seen, but for the most part, this was taken from official team announcements. When a trade team announces their roster for the Tour de France, they generally give a couple notes about what the roles will be on the team and who's doing what. So this is how you can confirm explicitly who's in the lead out for what sprinters, etc. All right, let's jump in. Matteo Verche, I think he is the best person to pick up for a number of reasons. First of all, he's one of the best ranked riders overall that are costed this cheaply, being in the roughly top 200 world ranking right now. He's also been active in breaks this year and last year. Last year, he was in 3 breakaways, which is more than you can say for anyone else on this list. And by far, he scored the most points in the fantasy game last year among anyone on this list. I actually, funny enough, could not find an official team announcement from Total Energies explaining what their roles are, but everyone knows Verche is going to be in the breakaways, and he's one of only 2 riders that from this team that are this cheap, and we know that Total Energies is always going to be sending people in the breakaways. And if you take the very naive assumption that the lowest costed riders on their team are the worst riders on their team, which I don't necessarily believe is true, but if you assume that, then they may be the sacrificial lambs that are sent out by the team in those breakaways that are just for TV coverage for their team jersey, the TV breakaways that are doomed to fail on the flat sprint stages in the first week of the tour. And those are really valuable breakaways to be in because, first of all, not many people are in them. And second of all, they go all day. If Verche is in the breakaway on stage 1 or stage 3, he might get 180 points just from being in the breakaway, not to mention the mountain points and intermediate sprint points, etc. Enough said about Verche. I think he is the clear best pick for 7 stars. Alexis Renard was my top pick for this category before I looked a little bit closer at all of the data. First of all, he's the highest rated overall rider in the Pro Peloton amongst this group, rated 137 in the world. But also, it's been stated by his team that he's going to sprint alongside Coquard. So even though he's a sprinter, you note that he's classified as an all-rounder, he is not going to be a dedicated lead-out man for Coquard. He's going to have his own freedom to sprint alongside him and give them 2 options in days where maybe one of them is not feeling great, or even if they're both feeling great, they're going to sort of float amongst the other teams and fight for themselves. So I expect Renard to be a really cheap way to get an extra sprinter on your team that's a real sprinter. I mean, he's not the best in the world, but he's a real sprinter. And that's where you see these PCS ranking, this low ranking come from. To win races, you need to finish high up in races, you need to have a kick. That said, this is a pretty negative factor here. The fact that he did not finish either of the first two tours that he started, as well as the fact that last year he was in the tour and he only scored 11 points and wasn't in any breakaways. So the reason why I think it's different this year has to do with the profile of stages. And so if you can only afford one seven cost rider, I probably wouldn't go with Renard. I'd go with Verche. But if you're going to have two on your team, Renard might be a great one to pick up for stage one and then have him be the first one you plan to drop once you've identified a different trade that you need to make on your team that requires you selling a seven cost rider, because his utility is probably going to go down as we get through these sprint stages. He's not going to be quite as valuable in the hillier stages as Verche will be. The next one is really close. I considered putting him up ahead of Renard, but Anders Hallen Johannesson, the twin of Tobias, he is. I forgot to mention, Verche is also a young rider, so that matters a lot. But Anders, he is also very highly ranked among the pro peloton. He's been active in breakaways this year. He's making his Grand Tour and Tour de France debut, so we don't have a lot of data on him. It's also unclear exactly what his role will be on the team. And that's why I'm giving the tip to Renard above Holland Johannesson here. It's not clear whether Anders is just going to be working exclusively for his brother, who will probably be going for GC, or whether he's going to have freedom. But he's on incredible form. Based on strength alone, he's possibly the strongest, probably the strongest of these riders. He just won the Tour of Slovenia. He's in really great form. He's in his first tour. I think he's going to be eager to prove himself. It's just a question of whether or not he's going to have the freedom. So he's definitely someone to look at, but also because he's more of a climber. He's classified as an all-rounder, but he's a bit more of a climber. You can see that in his rider profile. You don't necessarily need to pick this guy up for day one. He's more likely someone that you should keep in mind to pick up later in the tour. All right, moving on. This next category. So Gachenard. Gachenard was the second highest point scorer from last year's tour amongst this group. He scored 159 points. Not bad for a throwaway. I mean, you would hope for more, but from a low-cost rider, you can't necessarily expect more. He was actually cheaper last year. He wasn't 7 stars. And he was in a long breakaway, so that's where a lot of these points came from. He's also been very active in breaks this year, and that just, again, goes to these young riders, young French riders on the French pro team. They're going to be active in breaks. Like, a big part of the objective of this team at the tour is to be visible. And so Gachenard's going to be one of the guys that's going to be thrown into the breaks. I don't quite think he's as strong or reliable as Verche, which is why he is in this lesser category, but he's definitely a good pickup. Mattis Louvel, I really don't know too much about this rider. There's been a few riders I've called out in my videos that I don't know too much about them. This is my first time really looking into Louvel. I don't know much about him, but when I started to look at the data here, it's just a lot of green. You know, he finished highest of anyone in this list in his previous Tour de France finish. He was 65th. Now, you're not getting a lot of points for that, but it means that you're reliably towards the front of the race. And he was in 2 long breaks during his last Tour de France. He's also been active in breaks this year, a couple long ones, and is a relatively high-rated rider. It's not 100% clear to me what his role will be, and if he's a lead-out man, that's not great. But I don't think he will be. Just looking at his profile, he's not much of a sprinter. Not that there's too much data to look at there, but also his team is more of a stage hunting squad than a pure sprinting team. So I'm assuming he'll have some freedom, and if you want to take a risk on him, he might be one of the breakout riders that earns a lot of points. Also, Sean Flynn, just a couple, positive things line up here. He's a young rider eligible for the white jersey. He's a fairly highly ranked rider. He's been active in breakaways this year. He's making his Tour de France debut, but he has a kick on him. He can sprint. The only concerning thing about that is it's not clear whether he's part of the lead out for London Dressen. He wasn't mentioned by name in their press release, which isn't super concerning because Picnic didn't name any of their lesser riders. They only named a couple in their press release, but I just don't know exactly what his role is going to be on the team. And so if you're really trying to take one more 7-cost rider that's going to differentiate you from anyone else, I probably recommend Mattis Louisville over Sean Flynn, but I don't know. He's one to look at. I'm not really going to talk about anyone else in here, mostly because the majority of the riders in this category that might look appealing, and this extends to 6 stars as well, the riders that might look appealing, they're domestiques or lead out for strong riders. Like look at Pascal Incorn. He's one of the strongest riders, if not the strongest rider amongst this group. Maybe not the strongest, but he's a very strong rider. He's been very active in breakaways this year. He was active in breakaways in his last tour. But he's definitely here to support either Merlier on the sprint days or Evenepoel on the GC days. Like, there's no way that Pascal Incorn is going to be doing anything for himself. And if he's in a breakaway, it's maybe to try to get up the road to help out Evenepoel later. But he's just not a good safe pick because of that. I mean, you look at someone like Bert van Leeuwenberger, who's, by the way, at 32, the oldest uh, Tour de France debutante for this year, which is kind of cool. Good for him to make it finally after all these years as a pro. But he's the last man for Merlier, so he's not going to score like hardly any points. So that sort of applies to most of these guys. I love Luke Durbridge. I'm a fan of him, but he never scores any points. He scored 14 points last year, and that's finishing the tour, I believe. Um, so yeah, he's totally going to work in support of his leaders. All right. So skipping down through the 6 cost riders, spoiler alert, none of these guys are good pickups. Don't pick up any of these 6 cost riders. They're all lead out men. Now we're only left with 4 potential riders in the last category of 5 cost riders. And spoiler alert, they all kind of stink. The only one that seems to be a somewhat decent rider is Elmar Reinders, but he is the lead out for Groenewegen. I think he's the second last man in that train. Um, so yeah, he's probably not the best to pick up. But if you are forced to pick up 2 riders, I think the fact that he's a lead out man for Groenewegen isn't quite as bad as being a lead out man like uh, on Soudal Quickstep or on Alpecin, where there are realistic chances for every stage. I mean, Groenewegen is not super reliable and sometimes doesn't even use his lead out. And, there might be some days where Groenewegen's just sick or not feeling it. And Reinders is able to go up the road or maybe just contest a sprint himself. That's a possibility. So if you need 2 5 cost riders, he's my second recommendation. I skipped ahead of Sebastian Grignard. Grignard is my number 1 suggestion for picking up a 5 cost rider. And, partially that's because it's not clear that he's dedicated to support leaders on his team. They have no big GC rider on Lotto, and they only have DeLee for the sprints. And he's not listed as part of their final 2 men for the sprint lead out. He's in the press release, they said he can take on various roles. So yeah, he's probably just working in support of his team, but there's more of a likelihood that he's going to have some freedom than the average domestique. And also you can see he's been active in some breakaways this year for 300 kilometers. But the number 1 reason why I'm suggesting you pick up Sebastian Grignard, and this is where you have to take my advice with a grain of salt, it's because he's classified as a climber. And I think that this year, especially in the first week, which is what we're really talking about right now, there are going to be so many all-rounders that you want to have on your team that you are going to be at the cap of 5. I don't think you're going to have more than 1 leader. I personally have Tadej Pogacar as my leader from the start, at least for right now. I don't think you're going to have a bunch of climbers from the start because they're pretty much useless. I think you're going to have potentially 6 or 7 riders that are either sprinters or all-rounders. And in order to have the most flexibility to react when a good rider identifies themselves, you really want to have enough room for 5 all-rounders. And the best way to do that is to have one of these throwaway riders that you don't really care too much about, have them not take up an all-rounder slot, have them take up the climber slot because that's the least crowded slot in the first week of this year's tour. If you're curious about what I mean about that, check out my last video about the riders for this year's tour and some basic strategies, because I go through the stage profiles of which stage are sprint stages, hilly stages, and what that means for the fantasy team. But long story short, being a climber is very valuable. So I recommend Sebastian Grignard as your top five cost rider. I could talk for hours about this because it took me a couple hours to put together all this. But at the end of the day, if you're looking for the TLDR, five cost rider, pick up Sebastian Grignard. Six cost rider, don't do it. Pick up Sebastian instead of any of these six cost riders. And seven cost rider, pick up Verchet or Renard or Holland Johannesson. All right, this may be my last video before the tour starts, but I'll definitely be posting some update videos throughout the tour as we start to get some data coming in from the performance of these riders in the tour, which is going to be really exciting. So stay tuned for that. And as always, if you're looking to join in the discussion, we've got a pretty active community in our Discord server. So there's a link in the description below to join that server. All right, that wraps it up. Take care.